Chapter 7: Arrest and Detention. On arrival back in Salt Pond, I was greeted with the news that the United Africa Company had ordered us out of the office we had rented from them. I never discovered for certain who was behind this sudden eviction order, but it seemed pretty certain to me, having regard to the coincidence of events, that the administration had had a hand in it, believing as they did that I was connected with a disturbance in Accra. The following day, therefore, I moved to Cape Coast and managed to get a suitable place there on Prospect Hill. During the following week, while I was busy reorganizing the new office, news again reached me that an attempt was being made to round up and arrest the 6 members of the UGCC. The Big Six, as we came to be known, referred to Dankwa, Ofori-Atta, Akufo-Addo, Akorajai, Obetsabi Lamte, and myself. That same night I was suddenly awakened by 2 European police officers and 2 plainclothes men who ordered me roughly to get up and go along with them. Still in a daze at this nocturnal interruption, I was meticulously searched. They found 2 things that appeared to satisfy their suspicions about me, judging by the interest they took in them, and the pleasurable grunt that was made by the one who took them off me. These were an unsigned Communist Party card that I had been given in London and that I had long since forgotten about, and a document known as the Circle. Both of these were confiscated. They demanded to know what I was doing with the Communist Party card in my pocket. Was I, in fact, a member of the British Communist Party? I told them in all honesty that the card was of no consequence and explained to them where I had got it, and that when I was in England I had associated myself with all parties, ranging from the extreme right to the extreme left, in order to gain as much knowledge as I could to help me in organizing my own nationalist party on the best possible lines when I eventually returned to my country. They made no reply to this but told me to get my hat. I never wear a hat, I told them. When they made signs for me to follow them, I stood where I was and asked them on what authority they were arresting me. Of course, I had little doubt that everything was in order as far as they were concerned, but in spite of this, I made a cursory examination of the wretched-looking document that was produced for me, entitled The Removal Order, FNK Nkrumah, 1948. Dated 12th of March 1948 and signed by the then Governor, Sir Gerald Creasy. This read as follows: Whereas I am satisfied with respect to Francis Nwia Kofi Nkrumah, alias F.N. Kwame Nkrumah, that it is expedient for securing the public safety and the maintenance of public order to make a removal order against him under the provisions of Regulation 29 of the Emergency General Regulations 1948, inserted in such regulations by the Emergency General Amendment No. 2 Regulations 1948, now in exercise of the powers conferred upon me by the said Regulation 29 of the above regulations, and in pursuance of such regulation, I do hereby make this order and direct that the said Francis Nwia Kofi Nkrumah, alias F.N. Kwame Nkrumah, shall be apprehended and detained, and that he shall be removed in custody as soon as may be to such place in the Gold Coast as I shall hereafter appoint by directions under my hand. And I do hereby further order and require that the said Francis Nwia Kofi Nkrumah, alias F.N. Kwame Nkrumah, from the time of his removal to the place to be appointed by me, and so long as this order continues in operation, shall at all times a. remain and live in and not leave or be absent from the place to be appointed by me, and b. comply in all respects with such directions and requirements as I may issue at any time. The order may be cited as the Removal Order 1948 FNK Kwame Nkrumah, and shall come into operation on the 12th day of March 1948. It seemed to be pretty well in order, and so I realized that there was no alternative but to accompany them to wherever it was they intended I should go. I proceeded downstairs, followed closely by the 4 police officers. Fortunately for me, I made no resistance whatsoever, because when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I suddenly found myself face to face with a squad of uniformed police, each pointing a gun at me. This shock was so great that I instinctively pulled back a few paces. Believing that I was about to be made the target of a firing squad, I turned to one of them and asked him what they intended to do with me. While he playfully tossed 2 hand grenades in the air as if it might have been rubber balls, he commenced to abuse me in such a way and with such language that I felt utterly disgusted. He said, among other things, that if I thought I could become governor of the Gold Coast, they would be very glad to show me what they did with such people. During a brief pause, while he was obviously searching frantically in his brain for something fresh to say, I said quietly, "Have you quite finished? If so, let's go." I was thereupon pushed into a police van and seated between 2 police officers, driven away to an unknown destination. Once or twice I wondered anxiously whether the van would be halted at some quiet and out-of-the-way place where not even my last words would be heard. I was so annoyed at being dragged out of bed at such an hour, and I began to doze. After what seemed to be hours of travelling, the van came to a halt. I was dragged out and discovered that I was at Accra Airport. There I was joined by my 5 companions, and this cheered me on somewhat, for until then I had believed that I was the only one being hounded to earth. Before long, we were put on a plane and flown up to Kumasi in Ashanti, where we spent 3 days in prison in safe custody. It all happened so suddenly that it seemed like a nightmare, and apart from the initial feeling of fright, my senses were rather dulled and numb. As the key turned on us in Kumasi Gaol, our spirits sank, and Dankwa began to sob noisily and declared that he would never forgive them for this. While we were in prison, we held several meetings among ourselves to discuss the problem that we might face if a commission of inquiry were appointed to look into the causes for the recent disturbances. We even went so far as to draw up plans for a shadow cabinet and a future constitution for the Gold Coast, if and when the Burns Constitution was thrown overboard. It was during this period when we were thrown together in such close proximity that I had got the first indication of disagreement between myself and the other 5 members. I became painfully aware that they were losing interest in me, because whenever we entered into a discussion, the 5 of them would always make a point of supporting the opposite point of view to mine, and nothing I proposed was acceptable to them. There appeared to be a general belief among them that the whole tragedy of our arrest and suffering was my fault, and they began to make it plain that they regretted the day they had ever invited me to take up the secretaryship of the UGCC. Not satisfied with that, they even began to blame Akorajai for his part in recommending me to them. This disagreement, which ultimately resulted in a breach between myself and the working committee, was bad enough, but the thing which increased its severity 100-fold, as far as I was concerned, was when I suddenly discovered to my horror and grief that there was a reason for the formation of the UGCC which I had never suspected. Some of the most prominent persons in the movement had been affected in one way or another by the result of the Kibbe murder trial, and this was what had influenced them to join the UGCC. In the early hours of the morning of our 3rd day in custody, we were suddenly awakened and told to pack at once and to be ready to leave by 3 a.m. It was only later that I discovered the reason for the sudden removal. Apparently, when the youth of Ashanti heard that we had been detained in Kumasi prison, they planned, under the fearless leadership of Krobo Edusai, now a minister without portfolio, to attack the prison and to release us. What the outcome of this would have been, no one knows, because when they knew of it, the prison authorities wasted no time in getting us quietly out of the way. We left Kumasi by bus and arrived in Tamale, the capital of the Northern Territories, about 8 hours later. The news of our plight and of our journey northwards had already reached Tamale by the time we arrived, and crowds of people had assembled to see us. But it was a sad crowd, and both men and women were weeping. It seemed almost as if we were on our last journey to the scaffold. Beyond anything else, however, the very sight of us must have aroused sympathy, for owing to the excessive dust on the road, we were completely covered by a film of dirt, so much so that it was impossible to distinguish one from the other of us. We were taken to a bungalow on the outskirts of town, where we were left under guard for 3 days. Then we were split up and taken individually to various places in the Northern Territories, none of us knowing at the time where we were going. My destination was Laura. Here I was put into a small hut and kept under police guard night and day. It was a very lonely existence, but surprisingly enough, I enjoyed it. It was the first time in 13 years that I had been able to maintain quiet and undisturbed in one place for any length of time, and also, after the recent bickerings of my 5 companions in this plight, I was really thankful to be away from them. At least I could be left with my private thoughts, and whatever plans I evolved could not be immediately squashed by a majority. I was allowed to read books, but these, as well as any letters that came, had first to be censored by the district commissioner. Newspapers were forbidden. To say that I was completely alone throughout this period of detention is entirely untrue, for each night I was paid regular visits by a mongoose. This peculiar little creature used to appear at dusk and stay with me throughout the night. Sometimes I would wake up and find the poor thing sleeping by my side. I was touched by its friendliness and attachment for me, and I used to look forward to seeing it scuffling in around as soon as it began to get dark. I discovered later that it belonged to a doctor who had trained it as a pet, and who was then on leave, so obviously the creature was just as lonely as I was. After about 6 weeks of this more or less solitary confinement, the district commissioner came into my hut one evening and asked me to have my things packed ready to leave for Accra the following morning. Early next day, a truck came for me, and after picking up the other 5 at their various outposts, we arrived in Tamale, where we boarded a plane for Accra. On arrival at Accra, we were put in the annex of the Lisbon Hotel, situated at the airport. We then discovered that the other members of the executive committee who had not been arrested, had secured the services of a British lawyer, Mr. Dingle Foote, to present our case before the Commission of Inquiry which had been set up by the Governor under the chairmanship of Mr. Aiken Watson, K.C. The other members of the commission were Dr. Keith Murray, now Sir Keith Murray, at that time Rector of Lincoln College, Oxford; Mr. Andrew Dalgleish, a well-known authority on trade unionism; and Mr. E. G. Hanwett of the Colonial Office, who acted as secretary. They arrived in April 1948 and were appointed to inquire into and report on the recent disturbances in the Gold Coast and the underlying causes, and to make recommendations on any matter arising from their inquiries. The first thing that the commission did was to ask for our release so that we could appear before them. This was arranged, and for the first time in about 8 weeks we breathed again the air of freedom. Each one of us was called individually before the commission to give evidence and answer questions. I remember well Mr. Watson asking me what I had been studying in America and London. When I told him, he raised his eyebrows, and turning to the other members of the commission, he remarked, "Gentlemen, I fear we are in danger of getting into deep waters here." The most interesting thing was that, with the exception of one man, Mr. S. E. Akar, every member of the executive committee of the United Gold Coast Convention completely disowned the recommendations that I had put before them in connection with the organization of the UGCC. Several of them, upon being cross-examined, did admit that I had submitted these recommendations to the executive, but added that they had never associated themselves with it. The general idea that they were trying to put over was that I was merely an employee of the convention, and that as such they could not be entirely responsible for all of my actions. And so I was left holding the baby. The commission completed its work and issued its report in June of that year. This stated that with regard to the political situation, the members had come to the conclusion that the Burns Constitution of 1946 was outmoded, and they recommended its replacement by a more democratic constitution, which was to be drafted by the Africans themselves. They agreed that the people must be allowed to taste some political power as a means of satisfying their national aspirations, and they recommended that a committee should be set up to consider the drafting of a new constitution. As far as the observations which the commission made about myself were concerned, it is as well to let the report speak for itself. From the internal evidence of the minute book of the working committee, the convention did not really get down to business until the arrival of Mr. Kwame Nkrumah on the 16th of December 1947 and his assumption of the post as secretary. Mr. Nkrumah has had a varied career. He had a very diversified education in the United States and Great Britain, and in both countries appears to have taken a prominent part in all political institutions designed to promote a forward African policy. Although somewhat modest in his admissions, he appears while in Britain to have had communist affiliations and to have become imbued with a communist ideology which only political experience has blurred. In London, he was identified particularly with the West African National Secretariat, a body which had for its objects the union of all West African colonies and which still exists. It appears to be the precursor of a union of West African Soviet Socialist republics. Mr. Nkrumah appears to be a mass orator among Africans of no mean attainments. Nevertheless, he appeared before us as a humble and obedient servant of the convention, who had subordinated his private political convictions to those publicly expressed by his employers. From the internal evidence, we are unable to accept this modest assessment of his position. As appears from the minute book, the warmth of his welcome is reflected in the enthusiastic invitation from one member of the working committee to Mr. Nkrumah to use the organization as his own. From this, it is clear that for the time being, at all events, he was occupying the role held by all party secretaries in totalitarian institutions, the real position of power. There was found among Mr. Nkrumah's papers a document purporting to be the constitution of a secret organization called the Circle. Members of this body were required to swear personal loyalty to Mr. Nkrumah, with disquieting threats in the event of infidelity. In a working program circulated just before the disturbances we have been inquiring into, Mr. Nkrumah boldly proposes a program which is all too familiar to those who have studied the technique of countries which have fallen the victims of communist enslavement. We cannot accept the naive statement of the members of the working committee that although this had been circulated, they did not read it. We are willing to believe that they did. On the other hand, we feel that the working committee, fired by Mr. Nkrumah's enthusiasm and drive, were eager to seize political power and for the time being were indifferent to the means adopted to attain it. It is significant, although from his evidence it must be plain that Mr. Nkrumah has not really departed one jot from his avowed aim for a union of West African Soviet Socialist republics. The convention has not so far taken any steps to dissociate themselves from him. Mr. Kwame Nkrumah has never abandoned his aims for a union of West African Soviet Socialist republics, and has not abandoned his foreign affiliations connected with these aims. It is important to note that the inclusion of the word Soviet by the authorities was entirely a product of their imagination. It was never included by me in the document called the Circle. No doubt the authorities were so bent on labeling me as a man to be watched that they thought the introduction of the word Soviet in itself was all that was needed to imply a threat of communism in its most extreme form to the Gold Coast and to Africa as a whole. In December 1948, as a result of the Watson Commission, a committee was appointed by the governor. This committee, which later became known as the Kusi Constitutional Committee, was under the chairmanship of Mr. Justice, now Sir Henley, Kusi, and consisted of 40 members, each of whom had been nominated by the governor. A most important section of the community, however, had been entirely excluded from the committee. These were the workers, the farmers, miners, and petty traders, and the trades union movement. It was little wonder that dissatisfaction set in among a large section of the community who felt that, as the radical elements had been left out, the true aspirations of the people could never be satisfied. This dissatisfaction became so acute that, as succeeding chapters will show, I felt obliged to take action.